Gabby Pacheco with TheDream.Us, and I was this weekend at Haku presenting with Thomas Saenz, who is the president and general counsel of MALDEF. And I mentioned something about the Supreme Court and racial profiling, and afterwards we had a discussion about that. And I was really interested in your take. I think it's really important for us to have really clear information around legally what is happening. I'm not an attorney, so I really appreciated your take. But can you explain to us, because what I have understood and what I have heard is that the Supreme Court, in essence, gave a green light and a pass for, in essence, ICE and the federal government to use racial profiling to go after Latinos. And you told me that's not quite right. Can you explain what happened there?
Yeah, in the Vasquez Perdomo case, which came out of Los Angeles, as you know, and a judge had entered an injunction, a preliminary injunction against the ICE operations in LA, including their reliance on racial profiling, language, occupation to target people for interrogation and, in actual fact, assaults by the officers who are involved in the operations. But in the Vasquez Perdomo case, a majority of the justices did decide in an extraordinary decision. It's supposed to be very unusual. Unfortunately, not so unusual these days when it comes to the Trump administration, but a very unusual decision. Majority of the justices, six of them, decided to lift that preliminary injunction. However, because it came on what is called the shadow docket by many, meaning that it was an emergency motion to seek to stay an injunction, preliminary injunction, we didn't get the kind of full briefing, oral argument, and opinions by the justices that you get in a regular case that goes to the Supreme Court. As a result, we only know what one of those six justices in the majority thinks, and that's Justice Kavanaugh, who issued a concurring opinion. But notably, he was alone in issuing that concurring opinion. No other justice from the majority joined him. That means we don't know what the other five justices made their decision based on. We don't know that they, like Kavanaugh, somehow approve the continued use of racial profiling in limited ways in immigration enforcement because we don't know what their views are. It's just as likely that those other five justices may have decided that the standing issues are such that a preliminary injunction was not appropriate. And that's because standing to challenge and get an injunction on future activity by law enforcement is very difficult under long-standing precedent. So we really don't know from this Vasquez Perdomo concurrence what a majority of the court thinks. And indeed, it would be very hard to understand how that majority, which so recently in 2023 ruled out any consideration of race, even the most narrow and limited consideration of race in making admissions decisions to universities like Harvard and the University of North Carolina, it would be hard to see how they could say no considering race in any way in those circumstances, but still okay to consider race when it comes to immigration enforcement. Moreover, I think it's important to note that even in Kavanaugh's own opinion, there are unique elements to the Los Angeles situation that he cited as critical, including his stating that there are a high proportion of undocumented immigrants in the population in Los Angeles. Now, first of all, that's not really true. There's not a high proportion of undocumented immigrants anywhere in this country. But it is true that LA probably has the highest proportion of undocumented immigrants of any community in the country. But that is to say, no other community, including Chicago, including New York, including San Francisco, no other community has such a high percentage of undocumented immigrants in the population, raising a question of whether even Justice Kavanaugh would say it's okay to engage in racial profiling where the proportion of undocumented immigrants is much lower. Meaning, even Justice Kavanaugh might conclude there's no racial profiling permitted in Chicago, though we know that is occurring as we speak. So it's important because the decision came from the shadow docket. We only know one justice's views in the majority. It's important for those who believe they are the victims of racial profiling by immigration enforcement to step forward, contact lawyers, and see if you might have options to challenge the racial profiling, which in general violates the 14th Amendment and its Equal Protection Clause, but to find out if you might have a basis for challenging racial profiling involved in your detention or arrest by immigration enforcement authorities.
Yeah, it's so important, as you were saying, that that's kind of the follow-up question I wanted to ask is if you find yourself this happening to you, what you should do, and is this opinion by one Court justice the law of the land, right? How should we protect ourselves? How should we push back? And more importantly, uh, it was really important for me to hear this, to reframe this, because if we keep saying the Supreme Court allows for racial profiling, right? We are then ourselves saying this is acceptable when it's clearly one, it's wrong, but it's not even the law and acceptable, and there is
Yeah,
uh, things that
that's right.
can be done.
That's right. Anybody who's a victim of racial profiling, believes they're a victim, should contact lawyers, nonprofit lawyers, preferred, to see if they can challenge it. Even if this were the law of the land, and more on that in a moment, it would not have application to someone who was racially profiled in the past. This only has to do with an injunction that sought to stop activity by law enforcement in the future. But if they engage in a violation of the Constitution, including racial profiling, in the past, you still have recourse to challenge that, including to challenge it and to receive damages if you were harmed by that racial profiling. Now, as to whether it's the law of the land, we don't really know what the law of the land is because Justice Kavanaugh spoke only for himself, wrote only for himself. So I would treat his concurring opinion as what it reads as one of my colleagues noted. It reads like a really bad op-ed. And that's how I would treat it. Just a really bad op-ed by 1 out of 9 justices. We don't know what the other 5 in the majority think or their views. So it does not establish what is the law of the land by any means. That's a problem with the shadow docket. We don't get full indications of the Supreme Court's views. And whatever views we do get, they're only after limited briefing and no oral argument.
Yeah. And to conclude, I know this is not supposed to be a civics class or lessons, but in this moment in time, I think it's really important to remind folks all the different ways that our government functions and when one side of our government is not functioning as it should, right? So, unfortunately, Congress has not passed immigration law. So you have all these vulnerable immigrants, right? You're seeing from the Department of Homeland Security and the president, right, coming after immigrants and attacking them in a cruel way and very unlawful in many times way. Um, what would you say, right, that people and you just said people should be seeking lawyers and talking to them, right? Uh, is
Well,
there
the
something
judicial,
there? Like, should there be more suits? Should there be more litigation happening on in this part to help, right? Just balance.
yes, there should, and there will be. I think that's for certain. The judicial branch is a very important branch of the government. And although there are some bad judges on the federal bench, it still plays, the judiciary as a whole still plays an important role in limiting what the presidential administration can do. This unprecedented activity in immigration enforcement is, as you know, matched by unprecedented activity in so many other areas, that the judicial branch can be an important check on what the presidential administration is doing. Congress seems to have abdicated its role under the president so far, but they also have a role to play. And everyone has a Congress member, and they should reach out to their Congress member and demand that they act, play their established constitutional role in getting immigration reform, including protection for DACA recipients long term, into law. There really is no excuse for the Congress not to have acted with bipartisan supermajorities in support of relief for this cohort of immigrants. There's really no excuse for them not to have acted now for over a decade and a half, despite there being such strong support.
Yeah. And I did say before it was going to be the last question, but maybe parting thoughts. This message really, what we're trying to do is share with immigrants, students, folks, right, their rights. And so, can you make sure that we're crystal clear in a message to them saying that racial profiling, it's not just like for citizens, right? The Constitution protects everyone. And so, what's the message for immigrants who are, in essence, this is happening to them?
Anyone who is a victim of racial profiling should seek legal consultation, regardless of their status. Because as you said, this is a right guaranteed by the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause. And that is a clause that, by the terms of the Constitution, applies to all persons. So every person, not just citizens. There are a small number of rights in our Constitution that are limited to citizens. But this right, the vast majority of the rights in the Constitution, are for all persons, and that includes undocumented persons. So if you are a victim of racial profiling, regardless of your status, please step forward, talk to lawyers, and determine what you might be able to do to not only ensure that you are compensated for any harms you experience, but also that there's a warning to the federal government that they should not continue this unconstitutional, unlawful enforcement activity.
Well, Tom, you've been at MALDEF for quite some time now, 2009. Prior to that, you were also defending immigrants in California. You are a national treasure and definitely one of our most important civil rights leader of our time. So thank you so much for everything you do, everything that MALDEF does, and thank you for taking the time to share these words of wisdom and information with our scholars.
Thank you, God. Thank you.